Hey everyone, welcome to episode 9 of The Balanced Lens, where we talk about faith, culture, and politics from a Christian worldview. Today we are talking about a topic that is uncomfortable, that's really hard to digest, but necessary to talk about. If you're listening, it's a subject that is not appropriate for kids at all. And this topic really revolves around the British grooming scandals that ultimately resulted in rape and child sexual exploitation. Many people call these the British rape gangs. To kick us off, I wanted to show you guys a video and lead us into some of our questions.
It has gotten so bad in England. I don't think you've seen this. You're not going to believe this. And the people at home, you're going to be shocked if you haven't seen this already. So a woman here screams. She calls the police. The police show up. They check the neighbors and they find a 13-year-old girl naked and drunk. You guys will not believe who they arrest. Pat, you have to listen to this. Play this.
And at 2:30 in the morning, the next morning, a woman on the other side of Rotherham picked up the phone and dialed 999 because she'd heard a young girl screaming in the house next door. Police had gone round to the house. They found this 13-year-old girl with another young girl. She was almost completely naked. She was blind drunk, and she was with 7 adult Pakistani men.
7 guys.
She was drunk and leery. And South Yorkshire Police arrested the 13-year-old girl for being drunk and disorderly.
It has.
Yeah, so obviously hard to listen to, very difficult to comprehend and think about, but we're going to talk about this in depth today. So if you want to kick us off, what are some of the facts around this British grooming scandal?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of uproar on this topic, and rightly so. It is absolutely heart-wrenching to hear some of the accounts. And as we unravel this, what happened, I'm hoping that we will be able to provide more depth and more clarity and what we can learn from it. That's the most important thing. What can we learn from it so it doesn't repeat again? From a reporting perspective and a fact-based perspective, right, we're going to focus on official reports. So there is the independent inquiry into the child sexual abuse reporting. There is a 2025 audit. We're going to look at Department of Justice data from putting that all together, right? So when we talk about the grooming gangs, which is a colloquial term, the official term is called group-based child sexual exploitation, GBCSE. And it's a specific organized criminal behavior, right? So the broader umbrella is child sexual abuse. So that's a broad umbrella. And this is a subset of that umbrella, which is heinous, just like we heard the account in the video. So in terms of just scale, just so people have an idea, in any given year in the UK, we are talking about 500,000 total estimated child sexual exploitation happening. Now, this is a total estimate, but only a fraction of them are reported. So about 125,000 or so are reported and tackled. In those cases, if you look at who's the offender's majority white. I'm sure a lot of people have heard this. Most of the offense actually happened with people that the child knows. So it's mostly family or close acquaintances that are involved in these crimes. From a victim perspective, it's mostly girls, right? And we're talking about a good chunk of them are girls and then boys as well. So now if you zoom into the grooming gangs, the group-based child sexual exploitation, we're talking about 4,500 recorded offenses in a year. So here, as a subgroup, this is where we see the big grooming gang scandal come up. So there were certain areas like Rotherham and Rochdale where men of Pakistani heritage, so it is Pakistani Muslim men, were overrepresented in these crimes. This was a specific crime that had a very heavy, extremely heavy lean towards Pakistani Muslim men. And their target were mostly white working class girls. And they were mostly in homes, state-run homes. So we're talking about vulnerable girls who were falling into this trap and they were groomed and then they were exploited. Some of them were pretty heinous. Overall, like I said, again, it's white offenders. But when we talk about the specific issue of grooming gangs, which is only a small subset of the overall problem that we are dealing with, that does focus on the Pakistani group, right? Just so people have context, if we just zoom out and just talk about number of arrests, the national average of arrests per 1,000 people is 11.2. So in the UK, 11.2 out of 1,000 people are arrested annually. If you zoom into the Pakistani population, 11.3 people are arrested annually per 1,000. So it's essentially matching the overall average in the UK. What I'm trying to say, put there is like, there was a specific issue happening in specific locations and towns in the UK where vulnerable people, children were were groomed and raped, and this heinous grooming gang model thrived. That's summary of the facts.
Yeah, excellent. Honestly, I've watched a lot of videos and read a lot. You provided context better than anyone I've listened to. So excellent job providing context there. This happened over decades. It's still happening. I think there have been higher level inquiries that have just started in 2025, but there are cases that span decades here. And just as a caveat, we value ethnic diversity, we value religious diversity. What we don't espouse are anti Western or anti family values. Obviously, I don't know where child exploitation fits into this. I think no one likes, the abuse of children, right? But, we want to zero in on this and be very precise. And so when we look at the dynamics of this, why did this happen? How does a country that once held the mantle of Western values allow this to happen within their country?
This was the most stunning piece for me, right? So when I heard about this, it really shook me. Like, it takes a lot to kind of shake me because I've seen a lot in life, but this fact that it happened in the UK, which in my mind, right? So if I go to my parents and where I'm from, my parents were born in India. So we are very acquainted with the British system. Like, our English is based on the British system. How we drive on the roads are based on the British system. Our constitution and our courts are also based on the British system. So we consider Britain as one of the lights, one of the countries that holds the light to the Western civilization. And that kind of is really surprising how they fell into this, how this could happen in a country like that. So this is where we zoom into the problem, right? So now that we have context, one of the biggest issues that I've noted, what I found, was that it was not being brave. There was an institutional level cowardice that was causing this problem. And this is very apt to talk about because it's easy to blame other people, but we have to inspect ourselves and see how brave we are when in the face of something that will adversely affect us, our family, or our careers. So again, number one, institutional cowardice, right? Police, social workers, they feared being called a racist if they targeted any Asian heritage, or if we called somebody like this is a Pakistani gang. So this political correctness mentality, they prioritized community, the Asian community, over a child's safety, which is mind-boggling. So that is one big thing. Second, this is important too. There was a prejudice against class. There was attitude that said, oh, these victims are because they were mostly poor, they were mostly from troubled families, they were in care homes. There was this attitude that they're trashy, and oh yeah, the victims consented to this. Young girls, right? And so they did a lot of dismissing of some of these cases when it came to them, saying that those are like lifestyle choices, not rapes. It is just astounding how they could think that way. But these are the things that we need to guard against. Third, and this is like a summarization, right? They were more worried about risk management. Like, we have risk management teams in our companies. So this is like a risk management for them versus having a moral absolute on executing what is right and what is lawful. So that I think where that kind of summarizes. So just in summary, so it would be the institutional cowardice, like the lack of being brave, class, prejudice, and a loss of like moral standards and absolute values.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, when I look at what happened and why this happened, I break it up with the same responses, but in a different way. So there were the surface level reasons of why this happened. And a lot of these things that you mentioned are true. Victims were from vulnerable backgrounds. The children were from care homes or foster homes. The families were poor. The families were unstable. They were groomed with gifts and alcohol and drugs. They were threatened with violence. The authorities didn't believe the victims, as you mentioned. They dismissed them. They said that these were lifestyle choices. They labeled these kids as troublesome or promiscuous. They viewed these girls as consenting, even when they were underage. And so no single agency took ownership. Schools, councils, social services, they kind of passed responsibility. Information was shared, but everyone failed to really act. Those are the surface issues, but the core of what I think drove all this, as you alluded to, Biju, people were paralyzed by the fear of offending the community. Official inquiries like the 2014 J report on Rotherham, they reported from victims themselves, and they found out the police and social services, they feared being accused of racism, disrupting community cohesion. And so there were vast failures in data collection, victim support, perpetrator profiling. Reports of abuse weren't taken seriously for years because the police, they were feared being accused of racism. All this contributed to delays in really confronting the crimes. When it comes to the community, again, paralyzed by the fear of retaliation, they feared violence. Families discouraged reporting. There was really a power imbalance also between the victims and the abusers. Many of these abusers, they were operating in gangs. They had money, they had cars, they had local influence. And so many of the victims were scared because of that influence. Politically, MPs knew about this. Many politicians knew all about this, but they avoided investigating patterns and even naming suspects because they didn't want to be labeled as racist or Islamophobic, triggering community tension. Earlier in 2025, Elon Musk brought this to attention. He called out British Prime Minister Starmer. He said, "Hey, you should resign." And he said he was complicit in the rape of Britain. And this started this, full inquiry on a national level. But even during this time, the media knew and they were silent as well. Again, they were paralyzed by the fear of being called racist. Journalists were cautious. They didn't want to report ethnic crimes. Editors feared legal challenges, accusations of incitement. And so only after court convictions and official reports did widespread reporting really start to occur. And so, as you mentioned, this wasn't just one failure, right? It was a convergence of so many different factors that resulted in just complete institutional collapse. Now, to be fair, right, it could look like we're taking the arrows out, shooting them at like Muslims in the UK. We're called the balanced lens for a reason, right? Because we look at our own country, and this happens a lot in America, right? It happens a lot around the world. And the glaring example that I want to bring up is the Catholic Church in the USA. How is what happened in the UK different or similar to what happened amongst, the Catholic Church in the United States for decades?
Yeah, sad story. And it kind of gives a good view as we dissect the problem and be like, where is the root cause? Like, what is the root of all these problems? So let's compare the Catholic Church scandal that happened and the grooming gangs, right? Obviously, one of the biggest contrasts is with the UK grooming gangs. Over 90% are young girls in the Catholic Church, and we are now referring to what is called a John Jay report, like about 80% were male victims. And so these are also young children, so young boys. From a data perspective, just so people can compare one to the other, like if you just zoom in, so we talked about the 4,500 reported cases overall in the UK, but if you just zoom into like Rotherham, which was one of the epicenters of this problem, we're talking over like 1,400 victims that are reported, and over a 16-year period, right? If you compare that to the Catholic Church scandal, we're talking about 4,300 priests being involved in this, in abusing over 10,000 children, close to 11,000 children in a span of about 50 years. So if you just do the math right there, we're talking over 200 per year. And we're talking 200 per year if it's unique, but this is repetition over time. It just shows another big failure, right? Why did it happen? The strict hierarchical structure, the fear of going outside the reporting spectrum, right? And also like the thing that they did, which was kind of weird, was you find a problem, and their solution was transfer this priest who's sexually abusing children to another diocese. Like, that just shows, and this kind of is a great parallel to what you were talking about the UK. The media passes the buck to the legal system, the legal system give it to the police, and nobody's owning the problem, right? And the reason is because nobody's courageous to take it forward. And the same problem here. It's not that it was not known. People knew. The Catholic Church knew. There was a lot of settlement that happened after this worth billions of dollars. So this was a known problem, but instead of confronting and solving it, they just tried to hide it. Like there's a lot of parallels between these two things. And it also shows, let's be careful, not just isolating Muslims or Pakistani Muslims. We're talking about Christian Catholic priests. Let none of us try to be overly self-righteous in anything, because we need to confront the truth head on to understand what is causing deep within our natures so we can start chipping away at how to solve it.
Excellent. And you nailed it in so many levels there. And like you said, police knew. I don't think people realize that. In the Catholic Church scandals, police knew. They treated abuse as an internal church matter. They deferred to bishops, assuming discipline had occurred. Now, at the time, many police, they lacked training on child sexual abuse, especially pre-1980s. They were reluctant to challenge bishops, prosecute priests, and then anger Catholic voters or Catholic institutions. Social workers knew, but mandatory reporting laws were not strong. They were weak. Mandatory reporting is a term in the social work field where you are mandated to report what you hear from a child immediately, not 3 weeks later, but immediately. If you're a teacher, social worker, you work in a church, you're a psychologist, you know what mandated reporting is. Clergy were sometimes exempt from mandated reporting during this time. Many schools knew. They noticed behavior changes in kids. They noticed priests were problematic. Like you mentioned, Biju, they were just reassigned to another parish and hope that they would change. But the hierarchy and the role of the Catholic Church was a factor. Bishops and church officials knew, like you mentioned, they didn't report abuse to police. They tried to handle allegations internally. They feared scandal. They feared what harm it would do to the church. And so all this directly limited what authorities could act on. The dynamics are so similar, though. You compare the grooming gangs and the church abuse, right? Victims were dismissed as unreliable. Institutions, they avoided scandal. Perpetrators moved around. Priests were reassigned. Fragmented accountability. In the UK grooming gangs, the one difference is that authorities feared being called racist. Within the Catholic Church scandals, there was a fear of attacking a powerful religious institution and being ostracized. Now, why are we bringing this up? I think, Biju, you nailed this. The reason we bring this up is because we courageously, or unfortunately, identified a problem and we made changes, right? In America, we tend to pursue justice once evil is exposed. What happened after all this, right? Mandatory reporting laws were expanded, clergy reporting exemptions were narrowed or eliminated. A statute of limitations was eliminated. There was a look back windows allowing old cases to be filed. Those were opened up. Church policies requiring reporting changed. All these are reforms that resulted as a result of the, Catholic Church scandals. So change happened. Reform came once we identified the problem. Given what happened, right, with these British rape gangs and why it happened, can this happen here or in other Western cities to the same extent or to the same magnitude?
It's it's a natural question that follows the topics that we're talking about. And so, like, if we zoom into the grooming gang per se, right, we don't really have that specific pattern over here. It takes a little more different style over here. So we don't have like a taxi or takeaway on the street grooming model generally happening here. But ours is more, in the US, it's more like sex trafficking rings happen. And there are like MS-13 and other gangs operating. So it is a problem, but it's not the exact same as what is happening in the grooming per se, but it is a problem. So if you look at like just like sexual exploitation, right? Even just looking at the US, based on DOJ data, Department of Justice data, 71% of the US defendants in sexual exploitation and abuse of children cases are white. Now, if you look at gang models, if you talk, that's a lone actor model. If you talk about gang models, now the dynamic shift a little bit in the US. We have defendants are like 53% black and 47% white Hispanic. So the gang models shift when it comes to the U.S. But if you take a step back, right, that is specific. We're talking gangs and sexual exploitation in gangs. What is surprising that is like a little eye-opening to me was like the prevalence of child sexual abuse in the U.S. is like 28%. 1 in every 3 to 4 girls are sexually abused, and it's not as high in the UK, but 24% in the UK too. 1 out of every 4 in the UK, and specifically girls are abused. This doesn't mean boys are exempt, by the way. So for boys, it's like 1 in every 6 to 13 boys, but girls are much more prevalent. And like I mentioned earlier, 90% or higher of these cases involve families and acquaintances. So this is a broad problem, right? I'm just zooming out one level. It's not as heinous and as like disgusting as what we talk about when we talk about the gang violence. But why do we have such a big problem? Like, what is going on with people? And this is not a unique thing for the West or East or this generation. This has been going on for time immemorial across the board. But we are supposed to be the Western civilization. We're supposed to have risen above this, or one would assume, just based on the high moral standards we preach across the globe. That would have been my assumption, but it does not seem to be the case. So I just think that we have to like try to see how we kind of resolve this issue in a way that is attacking the root of the problem, not just going surface level and just accusing ethnicities of problems. This to me seems to be a fundamental problem with human nature.
Yeah, completely agree, right? This isn't a Pakistani grooming gang problem in the UK. This is a human nature problem, right? Across every society and civilization. As you can see on this podcast, we equally offend every race, whether you're white or Muslim or black or Hispanic. This isn't targeting one group here. But getting back to the question, right, given what happened and, why it happened, right? I think one thing to look at as well is that in America, when crime is exposed, we tend, not always, this isn't perfect, there tends to be a spotlight on it. We tend to try to fix it, right? What happened in the UK is that this still is happening. It's now under official inquiry at a national level in 2025, finally. There have been local investigations, but after much publicity, I think it's finally reaching the level of national uproar here. And why does that happen? I think, number one, free speech laws in the UK are weak and abysmal. I'll say it like that. And I'll explain this in a second. But when free speech protections are weak, citizens, social workers, and police, they're effectively silenced in their ability to confront evil. For example, and I'll explain it this way, the UK has no single constitutional free speech guarantee, and instead, they balance free speech against other social interests. Speech can be lawfully restricted to prevent harm, including laws against hate speech, laws against harassment, speech deemed likely to cause alarm or distress. For example, in Great Britain, you're not allowed to say something hateful that disrupts social cohesion if it meets the legal threshold for a hate crime or incitement. Well, who's to judge if something is hateful? Under the Public Order Act of 1986 and the Crime and Disorder Act 1988, expressions stirring up hatred based on race, religion, or sexual orientation, if it's likely to cause harassment, alarm, distress, or public disorder, they're criminal offenses. Think about that. If someone perceives something you say as causing distress or hateful, it's a criminal offense with penalties up to 7 years. And you can go online and you'll find all kinds of videos and anecdotal stories of people having visits from police or being sent to jail because of something they posted online. To dig into this further, right, Section 127 of the UK's Communications Act in 2003 makes it an offense to send grossly offensive, indecent, obscene, or menacing messages over a public electronic communications network, or to persistently use such networks to cause annoyance, inconvenience, or needless anxiety. This is really broad, right? And so this also applies to social media and text. And so it applies to online trolling. And as you can guess, it caused a lot of controversy over free speech, prompting guidelines to focus on credible threats and serious harassment. Some of the key provisions, right? Sending messages that are grossly offensive, indecent, obscene, sending false messages to cause annoyance, persistently using social media to cause worry or inconvenience. All this includes the internet. It includes phone networks. Imprisonment up to 6 months is possible. Online, you can go and search different cases. Twitter joke trial, the April Jones case, prosecutions for insensitive Facebook comments. And so what am I getting at here? All this has put a muzzle on British society to actually call out truth, because God forbid you call it a racist and you disrupt social cohesion because you're identifying a group of people or calling out rape within a community. Suddenly you're putting your rights in jeopardy because you could go to jail for essentially disrupting social order or stirring up hatred. Now, by contrast, if you didn't know this, The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution provides exceptionally strong protection. It's vastly different when it comes to free speech. Bars the government from restricting expression based on viewpoint or content, with only narrow, well-defined exceptions, like incitement to imminent violence, truth threats, or obscenity. For example, if you tell someone, "I'm going to come to your house and kill you tonight," you will probably go to jail or get arrested. As a result, right, because of our broad protections, even offensive speech, hateful speech, particularly extreme speech, is generally protected and it reflects this deep commitment to individual liberty, right, and really distrust of government. So, in short, the U.S. model, we prioritize freedom from government interference, even at social costs. The UK model prioritizes social order and harm prevention. And what does this do? It really puts a chain, it puts a muzzle around people that want to speak the truth. And so you see what happened decades where people are afraid to speak out against, these types of grooming gangs because it was really putting their lives on the line. And so freedom of speech in America, it gives citizens, journalists, the media, law enforcement the ability to call out evil openly, unshackled by fear or unshackled by fear of restraint. And so, there's this vast difference, in our free speech laws that have really, I think, undermined the root causes of some of these issues in reporting crime. But moving on, right, thinking through this, right, we look at this and you think, you're a Brit in the UK or you're an American, right? And you want to identify maybe a group of people, whether it's the Catholic priest or the Pakistani Muslim, right, as complicit in rape and say that they did something wrong. Is that being tolerant? Like, is that being empathetic? I mean, how do we reconcile values like tolerance and empathy when it comes to public policy?
This is a very important question because I think there is a misguided version of Christian tolerance that even I've been thinking a lot about, right? From a Christian perspective, we tend to try to be nice and tolerant and merciful and empathetic, etc., etc. As I think through it, I think about tolerance as probably a downgrade version of mercy. Not quite mercy, but a downgrade version of mercy. And the counter of that is justice. So that's what happened here, right? There was tolerance towards the perpetrators and justice was not executed for the victims. So this was a supposed confusion. As you think about Christianity, reason why God just did not completely there are a lot of people argue, why doesn't he just forgive all the sins and just let it go and be okay with it and everybody goes to heaven? Why did God go through all the trouble of coming down, becoming like a man, living a life among us, and being brutally persecuted and crucified on the cross? Because justice requires that the due punishment is given. So Christ takes our punishment on the cross for us. That is why we are absolved, because Christ took it, not because God erased it, right? So there was a sacrifice that was made for this. My point being, God throughout the Bible is very clear about justice. He clearly says his heart always prioritizes justice above everything. You have to live a just life, right? If you think about that scathing quote that Jesus gave, like in Matthew chapter 25, where he talks about in the end times, there will be a lot of people who come and say this and that, and he'll be like, what are you talking about? And then he looks at the righteous. He's in this chapter, he's dividing the sheep and the wolves. And to the people that he calls righteous, he says, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, you welcomed me. I was naked, you clothed me. I was sick, you visited me. I was in prison, you came to me. Protecting the vulnerable is a key thing. God repeats this mantra over and over in the Bible. In the Old Testament and the New Testament, he talks about protect the orphan, protect the poor, protect the needy, show mercy to the widow. What he's talking about is be merciful, take extra care of those who can't take care of themselves, who are vulnerable. And children are the most vulnerable group of people, right? And like Jesus says, even looking at a child, he talks about them to be like them, that they are the ones who give them priority are considered to be high in the kingdom of God. This confusion about tolerance and justice is a misperception. It's a misguided kind of thinking, because tolerance does not mean we accept evil, right? Protecting the vulnerable supersedes everything. Political sensitivities, threat of us being jailed, we should brave. Like God is always looking at for someone to stand in the gaps and proclaim and be brave. That's what we see the theme in the Bible. And accountability through justice is the highest form of showing love to our neighbor, which is a necessary commandment from Jesus.
Yeah, beautifully said. An excellent way that you phrase that. When I think about reconciling Christian values like tolerance or empathy with public policy, empathy is a virtue to be celebrated, but it can become self destructive and harmful when it overrides reason and logic. For example, when we tolerate ideologies rooted in extremism and death and destruction just because someone is brown, when we tolerate open borders and allow unvetted criminals to come into our country just because another group is poor, when we tolerate open threats against Jews or white people just because another group is in a minority, our tolerance has become intolerant of actual empathy. Mercy to the wolf is really cruelty to the sheep. It's unloving, right, to elevate the feelings of others above rational judgment and self preservation. And so, as a society, we risk self destruction, especially when policy decisions prioritize sentiment over facts and security. And so, it's important to distinguish the difference between virtues and public policy. Otherwise, we're shooting ourselves in the foot with our own theology here. And so, if we look at these communities, whether they're Catholic priests, whether they're, Pakistani grooming gangs, are we afraid to tell the truth when it comes to communities that can't assimilate, especially those differences are apparent?
Assimilation is, I think, a topic worthwhile of deep thinking and conversation. People use it, I think, pretty loosely, and I don't know if they totally get what that really means. I was thinking through it a little bit, and this is why I love being part of this podcast, is because I really actually do some deep thinking and self-reflection. I was initially a student in the US, right? So when I was a student in the US, and my first year as a student, in my master's, they gave us free football tickets, college football tickets. So I go to a football game, and I absolutely fell in love with college football. Like, I could not wait to go back to the stadium and cheer on. I was singing the fight song and like doing all the stuff that kids do in football. I think those are all, when I think of assimilation, I think of all these things that make Americans Americans, right? We have fun together. We enjoy sports together. We go out and go to the park and go to dinner, and we have common values. We cherish our family. We cherish our kids. We cherish our friends. We take care of each other. There's lots of charity happening in the US, and being part of charitable organizations and giving, like these are all like when we say assimilate, what are we talking about? We're talking about interacting with other people. If you don't interact with whites, right, you tend to think back and be like, oh, they must be racist. How many white people have you talked to? Like, I've been in the US for 20 years now. I haven't seen an iota of racism anywhere. Not in the South, not in the North. I'm sure it's there somewhere. I'm not saying it's not there. We are not living like in a world of angels, but I haven't felt it. I do think that we do, like, people need to interact. We need people who come here to interact with people. Let them get into communities. Let them interact with whites and browns and go to Indian restaurants and Egyptian restaurants and Middle Eastern restaurants. Interact with people. The more you interact with people, the more you see them as human. They're like, hey, well, like almost everything I have common with you, right? So that's part of it. But from a data perspective, right, I do think that there are some assimilation issues, right? So meaning like we can learn from what other countries have tried and failed. There are places like let's look at Europe. Like in Sweden, there are places where people tend to just group together into certain places, and it becomes a parallel society that's running, that is not assimilated to other places in the same country. And they do see, like, sometimes that there is higher percent of people who are committing crimes. The US is a unique country because America was built on a wonderful idea, right? That all men are created equal. We can all come and we can enjoy the same inalienable rights. It is built with a whole bunch of immigrants. So we have got Native Americans, and then the vast majority are immigrants, whether they are first generation or 10th generation. There is from what I've seen and what I've heard and what I've been researching, the US has been a lot more successful with integration, with assimilation integration, because immigrants who come in, even if they are Muslims and Arabs, they tend to have higher educational backgrounds. Their salaries are higher. They are part of the economic model and the American dream. And I've seen a lot of surveys with Gallup and others that say that they're very highly patriotic. The percent of Muslims who proclaim patriotism to the US is similar or higher than the average the non-Muslim American. So, and they don't have any problem in their mind, according to these surveys, reconciling their Muslim faith with being an American patriot. So assimilation is a challenge when you have disproportionate number of people coming into specific locations and then failing to integrate with the community, but they then just, it's a whole bunch of families and they're in a small little town and they don't interact with anybody in the world. So then they find really hard to then get integrated. So the other thing in the US, for example, is most people who come here know English. They speak English. English is a common language. We're talking so I do think there are a lot of things that we do well, but we have to be careful that we don't go the wrong track and just open up the borders. So that's what happened with Europe. There was a lot of quote unquote open door policy with a lot of, because there's been a lot of conflicts in the Middle East and other places in the world. They welcomed a lot of immigrants in the name of being open-minded, and it's a Christian philosophy to welcome the stranger and come in. There is something, and again, I'm not saying that I know this for a fact, but I think we need to think through the rate of inflow just to make sure that we have enough time to really assimilate. And then from an assimilation perspective, the question is how do you do it? I think the most important thing is to make sure that people just don't, like when I was in college, right, over here, there was a small group of Indian kids, and they all always stuck together. So they spoke the same language, which was not English, their native language. They cooked their native food. But I'm not saying they did not assimilate, because they still went out and the American games and everything. But some communities may struggle with that, especially the older, more uneducated, less socioeconomic status people. So we have to be careful with this assimilation principle, because we do see some examples in Europe where it's not quite worked and they're having issues to deal with. Some countries are even doing some reversing on their stance of immigration. They have become strict. They've closed down I forgot the country. I don't know if it was Denmark or Norway. One of those countries kind of did the reverse, because they noticed there are communities that are not assimilating and they're having trouble. And the social cohesion problem is a problem there. Most of the people are wonderful, right? Whether it's Western, I'm talking Western Europe, the US, the white. I'm talking about the native, when I say native, not just Native Americans, but the whites, the traditional whites. I mean, I've come across so many wonderful people that I can't even, there is nothing bad I can say about them. So I really feel bad when people, I don't know why, but they term them as racist and bring them down. And then because the reason why I bring that up is I think there are a lot of whites who feel so guilty and so scared that they overreact and they're extra careful and extra nice just to make sure that they don't get labeled. And it's not fair, because they've been nothing but nice, and just there are errors, there are mistakes. I'm not saying everybody's an angel, but to make them feel guilty like that and to call them racist consistently, I do not agree with it, and I don't agree with it, and I wish we stop thinking and talking about race all the time in that.
Yeah, assimilation is interesting and very well said, Biju. If you were running for senator, I'd vote for you. I think you had some excellent points there that I would love to talk about more on future podcasts. But assimilation is complex. It is a process that has to occur. It's a widely researched process. But what we see in the world, right, we see this dangerous clash of Eastern and Western values that are not, where assimilation is being lost. A new report just came out yesterday showing just how scared Jewish students are on campus. 39% have been forced to hide their identity on campus. This is in America. 62% have been blamed for Israel's actions. 58% have personally experienced anti-Semitism. Only 12% say incidents were properly addressed, including, I know, friends that I know who shared those sentiments who are Jewish. But looking around the world, Bondi Beach last week, we had a Hanukkah celebration where Jews were gunned down. We look at what happened in Brown University. There was a conservative intentionally targeted in a class that was being taught by a Jewish professor. A Jewish professor of nuclear physics at MIT was killed. Many people believe, as of today, it's probably the same killer. Orthodox Jews were assaulted on a subway this week. We see in Amsterdam peaceful Hanukkah celebrations being disrupted. Jewish family in California was hit in their home by gunfire. Um, Islamic terrorist attack in Poland. Islamic terrorist attack foiled in Germany. Foiled in Poland, excuse me. Thwarted in Germany, right? There was a Christmas market in Germany where this attack was thwarted. France canceled New Year's Eve and Christmas celebrations because of a higher chance of a terrorist threat happening within Paris. And so we have to look and we have to be honest with ourselves and say, is there a problem? And there is, right? Aristotle said that courage is the first of all human qualities because it's the quality which guarantees the other virtues. And as a society, I think we've defaulted to fear. We have to look at this and say, there's something wrong here. We're afraid to address cultural issues, especially when they're apparent. And I think if we're unwilling to tell the truth about obvious cultural issues, the clash between Western and anti Western values will not quietly fade away. It will detonate with consequences that inevitably return to us. So it's not racist to want to protect and preserve Western values and desire that other cultures assimilate, as you mentioned. There's no strength in diversity. That's a phrase that's tossed around a lot. If that diversity is a celebration of death and the newcomers to a culture simply want to kill you and overthrow you. If we refuse to confront the truth, right, this collision between Western and anti-Western values will not just remain theoretical. It's already happening. It will erupt into a crisis that ultimately explodes here. And so we see this happening around the world, right? We see that there's a clash of cultures that's happening in many parts of the world. And so the visceral reaction that a lot of countries are taking, including the US, is banning immigration from Muslim countries, right? That's been on the news. We see recently this exploded, especially with what happened with the Somali fraud scandal in Minnesota. Just yesterday, the Trump administration increased the list of countries to ban, I think, by another 12 countries. So I think it's 25 countries that are Muslim majority countries, which are have travel bans from the US. Is this good? Should we ban immigration from Muslim majority countries? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a great question, not one where I think you said the same thing, right? Don't just dismiss every question right from the get-go. At least think through it, and it's okay if your conclusion is no. You mentioned about the Bondi Beach horror that happened in Australia, which is it's very sad. But guess what? The person the hero who kind of got in the way and took a lot of bullets was a Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
I've also read that there are a lot of stats that say that Muslims give the most number of tips to foil terror plots in the US. So it's just I grew up in the Middle East. I have a lot of Muslim friends and they're just wonderful, right? So it's very hard for me to just say that it's a Muslim thing, right? It's definitely an assimilation thing for sure. 100%. The incarceration rates, we know that it's higher for the Muslim population than the average. It is. In the US, it's a factor of 6-1. If you compare the Muslim population versus the number of people in prisons, it's 6-1. In the UK and other Western European countries, it's 3-1. So there is a disproportionate number, but the question is it the fact they're Muslim? Or is it the socioeconomic background that's causing it? And that is the nuance that we need to divide it by. Anybody who does data analytics understand that sometimes you can make the data say what you want it to say. And we have to be careful because there are a lot of people who are absolutely wonderful Muslims. Now, there may be a disproportionate number who do pursue terrorist-like activities. So disproportionately more Muslims probably do that than Christians. That's probably true. And this is where the question becomes why and how do you stop it? But the vast majority are innocent people who also want to live the American dream and want to contribute and have contributed to our society, whether they're Muslim or Hindu or Christian. So I don't think that a blanket ban is the answer at all. I do think that there is merit in saying that there are certain countries you cannot vet the person at all. There is no record. And anybody who's lived in some of these countries, I've lived in India and other places, things can be swept under the rug. You pay enough money, that thing vanishes off your record. People, I think, in Western societies, maybe a lot of Americans, can't even imagine what that means because they haven't seen it. But there's a lot of that happening. And so that's where it gets tricky. If there are places where it's really hard to vet people, that's to be taken very seriously. I really wish the blanket test would be as simple as you're welcome to come to the US. The only thing I ask of you is love the country. If you have love for the country and what it stands for, then please come. It's fine. I don't care what religion you are. I don't care what color of your skin you are. It does not matter. But come legally as well. Do it the right way. So that would be a more ideal way to do it. Now, how do you like I read that there are in the tests that some of these European countries do, they do ask questions about values and systems and their understanding of the culture, etc., etc. So we could think about like, is there something else we can do to kind of tease that part out during the interview process, during the vetting process, etc. So like again, my answer to the question is no, that does not make sense. You have to have a more logical way because it also has to, you also want to stand by the principles that make this country really great, right? And to me, the reason why this country is unique, it's not necessarily, at least I don't think, it's not because we are more amazing human beings than other places in the world. It's because God has blessed this country. His hand is upon this country and he's protecting it and he's guiding it. So that, to me, like we should not go against those principles. That is, that makes our country great. The only other point I will make is, I know we talk about American values, but like our values keep shifting and, now we have a lot more controversial things going on in society. One of the things that I want to think through is, what is the American value when we say that, right? There is a lot of definite tolerance as part of it. You want to be straight? Sure. You want to be a lesbian? Sure. You want to be gay? Sure. We are a very tolerant society. That's why the discussion about tolerance versus justice was very important. And so when people come here, we need people who are also tolerant to it because we are tolerant to it, right? That doesn't mean we agree with it. And we are not saying that we agree with all the worldviews that people have in the US, but we tolerate each other and give them space to express themselves. The freedom of speech is there as long as you don't proclaim violence and incite violence and try to harm other people. So I love the model that we have in the US. I love our constitution. I love our principles that we say that all men are created equal. Everyone is equal by who? By God. So from there comes all of our systems of governance, and people need to love that, right? We do not want another parallel judicial system based on the Sharia law or whatever law on the side. No, there is one law and we are all under that law.
Excellent points. Really great points. I love what you said there. And I agree with so much of that. When it comes to this topic of Muslim bans, it's been all over the news, right? In the last few months for various reasons. To echo Biju's sentiment, there are amazing Muslims that live in the US. One of the first guys I knew who was a hardcore Trump supporter, he was a Muslim guy. He was one of my real estate clients. This is before Donald Trump was ever president. It was 2015. He was head of the New York City Police Department, Republican Party. He was gung-ho about Trump. He was a Muslim, and it confused me. I'm like, why is this guy a Republican? There are many that contribute to the academic world, to the scientific world. There are Muslim celebrities and Muslim athletes that make America the great country it is. You can do the research. There are many Muslims that are conservative. They share conservative values. They love America. They appreciate this country a lot. And so to say that we should just ban immigration from Muslim majority countries, it's a very blanket statement that needs more analysis. This whole issue is multifaceted and resists simple explanations, but let me give it a shot here. Bobby Jindal, he once said, and I'll paraphrase what he said, a friend told me this: immigration without assimilation is invasion. I'll say that again. Immigration without assimilation is invasion. Now, to think through the immigration part, I don't want to focus on race as much here, as whether you're Muslim or Christian or Buddhist, but we need to limit immigration from countries with weak governance, where extremism and terrorism are intertwined with governance and deeply embedded in politics. Afghanistan, the Republic of Congo, there's many these countries in Africa, Somalia, Sudan, Eritrea, Chad. There's a whole list here where we have bans from. This isn't about religion per se, as much as it is about extremism that is just prevalent, about weak government structures where, as Biju mentioned, you can't really vet a person properly to discern where exactly they're coming from. But the second part of that is really to pass comprehensive assimilation laws. Yes, we have immigration laws, but do we have assimilation laws? Assimilation is a process, it's multifaceted. Assimilation succeeds when immigrants are encouraged through law, through work, through language, through civic culture to become Americans in practice, not just residents in name. And so How do we do this? Did some research, 5 or 6 things here. Number one, restore English language primacy. Make English a first language that someone learns. Now, you could say, well, that's racist, that's horrible. That's actually a great benefit for someone coming to the country because English proficiency allows them to be mobile in the labor market, to get different jobs. It allows them to build social trust. It helps build national cohesion. And so requiring that proficiency before citizenship, I think it's a good thing. It's a different way to think about assimilation, but many studies show that asking an immigrant to learn English, it's a good thing for the person, it's a good thing for our country. Secondly, we need to reinforce civics testing, bring back teaching on constitutional principles, things like the separation of powers, individual rights and responsibilities, how our amazing government works should be something that immigrants learn. This knowledge, this civic knowledge, it fosters loyalty to constitutional values and it helps build a cohesive culture. Thirdly, I think we need to enforce the immigration law consistently and credibly because that's the backbone of assimilation law. Assimilation fails when the rule of law collapses, right? When we restore credibility to immigration enforcement, that helps assimilate. We need to end policies that normalize long term illegal residence. We need to reduce backlogs in the immigration system so people have faith in applying for application to a country and actually knowing what their legal status is in a clear and timely manner. Non enforcement of these things, it really undermines respect for our whole immigration system. And so this really harms legal immigrants the most. We need to prioritize assimilation when it comes to work and self sufficiency and labor market integration. Work is the primary driver of assimilation. Think about that, right? You're an immigrant to this country, you get a good job. You're going to assimilate really quickly because money is a good thing to have. Welfare dependency, it actually slows assimilation and increases segregation. But you allow immigrants to work and get good job, it's a good thing for assimilation. We should favor immigration, pathways tied to employment, to skills, to entrepreneurship. All this reduces dependency on the government. It allows employment to accelerate. It allows for cultural norms to be adopted more quickly. And so, allowing someone to be a productive member of our economy is a great tool for assimilation. Finally, another thing to do for assimilation, this is the fifth thing, is believe it or not, we need to strengthen local and civic institutions over federal bureaucracy. Assimilation happens at the local level, not at the central government level. That means faith-based organizations, local nonprofits, community associations. These are the organizations where, when there are community-led integration efforts, assimilation happens. Top-down programs tied to treating immigrants as clients don't work. We need to really get into our neighborhoods and start teaching or empowering C3s and these nonprofits to teach American civic habits, to transmit these moral norms. Think about how this applies to the Pakistani grooming scandal. Did we have good community organizations in these areas helping with assimilation into British culture? I bet not. I mean, I haven't studied this, but I can probably guess that there weren't. Probably no assimilation there. And I'm not condoning anything. I'm just making a comment there. But a third broad category of what we should do is this. I talked about, limiting immigration. I talked about assimilation. But thirdly, we should really look at how other Muslim countries eradicate radicalization. Extremism is not just a Western problem. It's a global problem. Extremism is a problem in Muslim majority countries. And I'm going to share a few things of what they do. These are not all things we could do, in America, but I'm just going to lay it out there because it's a podcast. Many countries reduce extremism by bringing religious institutions under state authority. Government licensing of imams, state-approved sermons, centralized religious ministries. For example, in Morocco, imams are trained under state theology, emphasizing moderation and loyalty to the monarchy. In Egypt, Al-Azhar University, one of the oldest Islamic universities, what they teach is placed firmly under state oversight. In Jordan, Friday sermons are standardized nationwide. Now, practically in America, we don't believe in state interference in religion. However, if a country that is deeply embedded in terrorism is training the imam who's now coming to your neighborhood in America, we need to seriously reconsider our immigration stance or our assimilation laws when we're allowing people from parts of the world where extremism is rampant to come into our country. Another thing these countries do, they use extremism, they use Islam itself, or Islam, to counter extremism by delegitimizing it theologically. And so they use modern Islam against radical Islam. For example, Saudi Arabia, post 2003, after the 9/11 attacks, had clerics publicly refuting Al Qaeda theology. Publicly. Indonesia, there's two organizations. By the way, Indonesia has the world's largest Muslim population. There's an organization called the Nadalatul Ulama, the NU. It's the world's largest Islamic organization founded in Indonesia in 1926. Their goal is to preserve traditional Sunni Islam, but they promote pluralistic Islam to the whole country. There's another organization like that in Indonesia called the Muhammadiyah. Again, the goal is to promote a moderate, pluralistic version of Islam to the whole country. But what they do is they frame radicalism as foreign and un-Islamic. And so if you look at, successful Muslim majority countries that have eradicated extremism, Indonesia, Morocco, Jordan, again, these are not countries where in America I want to emulate their human rights models or anything that they have. But I think it's worth for Americans to look at these countries that have eradicated at least Islamic extremism and to think, what can we do in our own country, whether it's Islamic extremism or far right extremism or far left extremism, to really rein in our society and allow us to live in a way that's cohesive, where we can celebrate American culture together. And so, obviously, a lot there to think about and talk through, right? We started off with British rape gangs, but this really goes into so many different aspects of society when it comes to immigration and assimilation and really self-reflection as a society and how we view our own institutions. So any final thoughts, Biju?
I think it's been a fantastic topic for us to dissect. I'm hoping that our listeners have gotten a good holistic view of the issue, some additional piece of information that allowed them to chew. I'm hoping that I do not want anybody in our audience to just take what we say for granted. Listen to it, go do your own research, confirm it, right? But come out having a more holistic view. I like some of the points that you made, that many Muslim and Arab countries, and they are different, by the way, Arab and Muslim countries are different, but many of these countries also struggle with extremist Islamist elements. So they are actually on our side fighting against these guys. That's one thing to remember. Then I do agree, 100% agree with having a common language, because we need more elements of unity, and language is a key piece of uniting people. Anybody who's lived in a multilingual society like we have, and I come from there, understand the struggles as soon as you go into another state in India, because I don't know if our listeners know this, but India has more than 100 languages, like in one single country, like main languages, which is crazy. So if I go from one state to another state, I may be stuck if that person doesn't know English, because English would be a common language. Hindi would be a common language, but most of the local people in another state will only know their state language. It is very hard to assimilate if you don't have some basic elements of commonality. From this podcast and research, one of the things that I'm taking as a takeaway for me as well is courage, being brave is extremely important. And I think this has shed a new light for me to reassess how I look at things and confuse sometimes being peaceful, being tolerant with the necessity for justice. So that is something that's a key takeaway. But very, very importantly, as a Christian, it is important to protect the vulnerable in our society, whoever they are, without any compromise. And I think the final thing I'll say as I think through the issue, right, is that we need to assess our heart and try to look in the mirror, check our heart and see what is the root cause of this problem. Why is 25 to 30% of young girls, right, children, being sexually abused? What is wrong with us as a people, as humans? We need a transformation of the heart. And this is what Jesus promises in the Bible, right, through his Holy Spirit to everyone who believes and follows him. And to everyone who's a so-called Christian, this should raise alarm bells. Like, if there is those kind of things hiding in our heart, those temptations, those evil desires, we need to be careful that we protect and guard our hearts, and also start to speak out and be brave when we see things that are against these fundamental values.
Very well said. Thank you, Biju. I know this has been a topic that's uncomfortable, hard to digest, but thought-provoking and necessary to talk about. I want to thank our listeners for taking time out to listen to us. Once again, we hope you guys can like and subscribe and listen for our next podcast. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great week.